This past week at work has been a lot. And somewhere between all of the chaos and frustration, I've come to the realization that there's a pretty big reason why I've always felt like I didn't fit in with corporate culture. And I think it really just boils down to the fact that I tend to be the kind of person that means what she says and says what she means. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm blunt or aggressive. I definitely believe in practicing tact whenever possible. I do believe that honesty without tact is essentially cruelty. So I'm by no means unprofessional when I speak to colleagues or supervisors or anything like that. But I tend to struggle with doublespeak. And I notice that a lot of people who seem to thrive in the corporate environment are very fluent in doublespeak. And I'll give you an example. So, for example, they might set up a department get together or a company get together, and they'll say it's totally optional. We'd love for you to be there, but no pressure. But in reality, they're actually judging you by whether or not you attend, and they make these assumptions about you based on that, totally independent from your performance from your actual job. And it's things like that that I consider to be double speak, where it feels like if you want people to attend and it means that much to you, then make it mandatory, right? I don't know if legally or whatnot they can or can do that. I feel like there have been events where it was mandatory, like Christmas get togethers or things like that, where they kind of like scheduled it during the day. Therefore, they knew you were going to be in the office. So it's kind of mandatory. But I feel like it's very unfair to judge people by an invisible standard that you did not communicate with the other person. And people in corporate are very comfortable doing that. I don't think they necessarily connect the fact that it's a little, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. Like, I guess you could say unethical or cringy or just like not in good taste to do something like that. Unfair, really, because you're judging people by standards that could impact their performance reviews, even though it's not necessarily related to the performance of their job. But I feel that it impacts the way that you're perceived. Another example would be when they tell us that their goal this quarter is to improve efficiency ratio. And as a result, we're going to be streamlining our processes, trimming the fat, and basically trying to reduce friction and costs where it makes sense, right? And so naturally, your team brainstorms and comes up with ideas to make things more efficient. And some of these ideas are genuinely good ideas, right? But if those ideas tend to conflict with maintaining the status quo of certain political relationships or hierarchies, then suddenly it's a no go. And you get all of these roundabout explanations as to why XYZ is not feasible or we just can't do that, right? And I'm not saying that those aren't valid reasons in some cases, but I do think that you should be a little transparent about what it is you truly prioritize, especially when you're leading a team and you have to pass information down to your employees. It's a little unfair to ask them to come up with ideas to quote unquote streamline and make things more efficient without disclosing to them that there is another layer that should be prioritized. And that should be, maybe eliminate options that would cause too much pressure on other departments or other teams. If avoiding politics is truly the priority, right? I'm not even arguing whether or not that's necessarily right, but I feel like, we're all kind of aware that things like that exist. So why not just be a little upfront about it? And I think that's the thing that bugs me the most. And I get it. I get that nobody wants to say that they're sort of bending over backwards for politics, or no one wants to say that they really want you to come to this department event or get together, even if you don't want to be there, right? Nobody wants to be that guy or girl that's kind of an asshole. But my whole thing is, if you've got asshole standards, then you should wear that asshole badge loud and proud. And if you're not proud to wear that asshole badge, then maybe you need to unpack and rethink your actual values. And this is something that I noticed people in corporate are really good at compartmentalizing. I've also noticed that a lot of these people are so good at anticipating the needs of the hierarchy or anticipating the needs of their superiors and just like having this very subconscious and intuitive pulse on, I guess you could say, self preservation or maintaining social harmony, that they just assume everybody else thinks that way as well, right? I feel like when I question things or I sort of bring this up in maybe not a necessarily super direct way, because I think you got to be careful. But anytime I touch on this, I notice that I sometimes get this look or a certain tone that conveys that they're surprised that I'm not seeing things the same way they're seeing things, right? And it's not that I wouldn't say like I'm disrespectful to hierarchies. I just don't think that they're the most important thing in the world, right? In my mind, and I've said this to my own supervisor, that just because someone is in a higher position than you does not mean they cannot be wrong, or that, you shouldn't speak up. And although he'll say, oh, I agree, whatever, that's not really how he operates. And I guess a lot of people in corporate, maybe this is why they've been successful and why they've gotten promoted, don't actually see it that way. They think that the people above them can never be questioned, can never be challenged, and that, they were promoted for a reason. And they've somehow convinced themselves that these superiors of theirs were promoted because they're the hardest working or the smartest or whatever, and that they just automatically know better. But I feel like in the corporate world, you get promoted by being a yes man or a yes woman and making your boss look good and reducing the friction between you two by just always agreeing and never pushing back. And even if you push back in a very tactful, professional way, they still sense that pushback. And in their minds, you're somehow perceived as, you know, not a team player or maybe not the easiest to work with. And so the reason that work has been so challenging this past week, really the past few months, I guess it all started going downhill beginning of the year, but the reason it's been such a challenge is because certain new rules and processes were implemented. And I believe the directive came from all the way at the top. I want to say maybe from the board or something like that. And it kind of just flows down to everyone down the ladder, the pressure, right? And my sense, I don't know for sure, but my gut tells me that a lot of the times our management team doesn't necessarily agree with the directive, but it doesn't feel like there's enough pushback into how realistic or reasonable or how achievable certain directives and goals are. And even though they might feel that way internally, since the priority is to maintain the hierarchy, a lot of the times, these people just, nod and say yes and just implement stricter standards or ask more of the people beneath them, right? So it creates a lot of pressure. And naturally, the people beneath will question, what is the logic behind this? And why do we have to do it this way and that way? Isn't it more efficient to do this? And I think even though there's a part of the leadership team that agrees and wants to sort of commiserate with us, for lack of a better term, they tend to, I guess, defend the directive. I don't know if it's an ego thing or because they're just trying to maintain order. I do think maintaining order is also priority in corporate. And so they just all fall in line and they get defensive and they make it sound like it's the most reasonable or sensible thing to be doing at this time, even if they don't necessarily agree, because every now and then they'll let it slip up in a one on one that they don't agree with XYZ, but their hands are tied and this is where we're at, right? And I get that. But at the end of the day, all of that pressure and all of those new requirements and asks fall on us, right? On the people at the bottom of the ladder, the analysts, the people doing the grunt work, all of that pressure trickles down onto us, right? And at some point, there's consequences to having all of that pressure put on you. People start getting really burnt out. People start making a lot of mistakes. People just start, looking for other jobs or like wanting to escape because there's no one beneath us to pass that pressure onto, essentially, right? And so we have to absorb it. And these past few weeks have felt like morale has been super low. We're like in this pressure cooker, and I feel like something's about to give. And I know for a fact that something's about to give because I have coworkers, we talk, and there have been talks of, maybe it's time to move on. Maybe it's time to look for another job. I myself am trying to make it a goal that 2027 will be my last year in that role or in that company, simply because I don't like the direction that the department culture has taken. And I'm not the only one. If I was the only one, then maybe they could chalk it up to, I'm just a disgruntled, terrible employee, whatever. But the fact that other people are feeling this way really confirms that it's more of a cultural thing. And over the years, things weren't necessarily this bad, but anytime that there's some kind of change, whether it's a leadership change, software change, whatever change, right? There's been a lot of changes that can have an impact on the direction of the department culture. And I feel that we're all sort of struggling with this loss of autonomy because the more that they ask of us and the higher the standards they ask of us, the more they monitor and the more they micromanage. And so our sense of autonomy seems to have disappeared lately. And that was a very big thing in my role in my department. And what we do was it's very independent, heads down analytical work. And we've never been a stranger to months where we've had a heavy workload, right? It's the nature of our industry. But we've always sort of had this pressure release with the fact that we had autonomy over our day to day. We had work from home flexibility on some occasions. We were sort of able to make up our hours. Like if you need to leave early, you just make up your hours in the evening, whatever, right? And we had more authority into how we decision our work, right? But now we're in a situation where the things that made the job enjoyable or the things that we perceive to be the benefits or perks of that job are no longer there. And we're just stuck with a heavy workload, right? And naturally, that creates burnout because now you've got nothing but cons, nothing but negatives to the job, right? And the only positive is essentially a paycheck and some benefits. And without the feeling of freedom that we once used to benefit from, it's kind of like, well, what am I here for? And you know, aside from that, there's also been a lot of, I want to say, confusion, conflicting decisions, things that naturally arise from management changes, leadership changes, and software changes, all of those things. All of those things are normal. I'm not saying that in my head I expect transitions to always be seamless, but my gut is telling me that the culture has shifted as well. And it's not just a temporary thing. They want to tell us that, oh, it's temporary, things will get better. But, I've been alive long enough and I've been in corporate and other working environments long enough to know when the tides are shifting. The pendulum is sort of swinging the other way lately, or we're being a little more conservative and defensive in our work. And I personally feel that takes away from what I used to enjoy about the job. So, long story long, I feel like my inability to compartmentalize things and sort of like shift values and standards as I see fit really works against me in a corporate environment, right? Because in order to sleep at night, you've got to be comfortable with holding different standards in different situations where I tend to be pretty consistent in my values, regardless of the situation. And so I feel like having to sort of like grit my teeth and just go along with it it doesn't feel like just a minor inconvenience to me. It feels like I'm doing something morally questionable or unfair or basically something that I just don't agree with on a deeper level. And that really has led me to believe that the kind of work and the kind of mission that I'm supposed to have in this lifetime has to be incredibly value driven and value aligned. Otherwise, I'm never going to quite thrive. And I like to think that I've been a decent employee, a decent hire my time during my time working in corporate. I mean, I've gotten promotions. I've always had really good performance reviews, but I feel like the older I get, the harder it is to stomach these things. The more I see through it and the hypocrisy and the self-preservation that's often prioritized above all else, it doesn't sit well with me. And maybe it was easier to go along with it when I was younger and I didn't understand how things in the world work, but I'm not that person anymore. And you would think that everyone kind of goes through that transition where the older they get, the more they see things clearly for what they are, but not necessarily, because we've got people in there that have been there for decades, decades. And I want to say it's eaten their souls at this point because, like when someone's been in a toxic environment for so long, they start to normalize things and think that, well, this is just the way the world works and you've got to do what you got to do. And they've somehow strengthened their ability to do these mental gymnastics. And I used to think that was such a deficiency on my part, the fact that, I wasn't able to get on board with things in that way. But now I'm beginning to see that, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing because do I really want to be that person? You know, there's a cost, I feel like, to being accepted into that tribe. And that cost is just too high for me, you know? I don't want to become hypocritical. I don't want to become super self-serving. I genuinely believe that if I'm in charge of a team or that there are people counting on me, like I need to do right by them. I wouldn't feel comfortable sort of like gaslighting and spinning things in my favor to sort of manage their reactions. Like I just can't do that. Right. And maybe that's why on some level I've never been drawn to like leadership positions. I've always preferred to be an independent contributor. I've had a lot of analysts or specialist roles, and I kind of feel like, well, if I'm in charge of my own thing, then there's less room for me to have to become that person that I don't like, if that makes sense. But yeah, and I think all of that has somehow led me here, led me to YouTube, and led me back to writing and trying to create content because I really feel like it's important to do value driven work, work that aligns with how I want to show up in the world, and work that will connect me with other people in the world who have similar values. Yeah, I think that's kind of all I have for today. I just wanted to put that out there because I feel like that was one of the more prominent things going on for me the past week or so. And I hope that one day I'm going to look back at this and feel super proud that I made a decision to carve my way out of this situation. I really hope that I can make 2027 the last year that I'm in this position at least. I don't know if necessarily I'll be fully out of corporate. I hope so. That's a leap, but I want to at least have made some kind of momentum or achieved this milestone, a bigger milestone in 2027, to being more aligned with who I am. And, if this vlog serves nothing else but that, I'm good with that. If this allows me to maybe connect with other people, great. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only person out there who's felt this way. I know a lot of my colleagues, not a lot, maybe like a handful of colleagues kind of secretly feel this way. So I know that we're out there. It's very a millennial thing to to be these days, challenging the status quo and the hierarchies. But if you have gone through something or you are currently going through something like that and you want to share your experience for me to read down below in the comments, great. Would love to connect and hear how you've navigated this as well. All right. Yeah, that's all for today. I'll talk to you guys later.